Blog Talk Radio.
This is BR on the World, Bostonred here. On the 26th of September 2013, we continue to adjust our programs. Today we'll feature an edited version of President Obama. He addressed the UN General Assembly this week in New York. And at the same time, workers were protesting at the White House. These were government workers that work in various government buildings across the U.S., such as the Smithsonian Institute, the Reagan Office Building, and various others. Most people don't realize that within these federal facilities, they are contracted out to the likes of McDonald's, the Subway, and various other enterprises, private enterprises. And these workers make from $7 to about $9 an hour, and they are demanding at least $10.10 U.S., which is not much to ask for a worker that is, say, working in Washington, D.C., or working in one of many of the higher-priced cities across the U.S. At one time, services within federal buildings, including the Capitol, they have a cafeteria there, it's subcontracted out to some private industry operation also. These workers were government workers, and they received government benefits and government retirement. But however, in recent years, starting with the American President Reagan in the 80s, and it was accelerated with President Clinton and his reinventing government, as he called it. It was a reinvention of government for business. It was pro-business, and it was a disaster for workers that worked for the government in many aspects. Thus, what we have now is 2 or 3 tiers of government workers. The increase in the U.S. of so-called contract workers, these are workers that are normally paid less, and in the instances that they are paid more, like Mr. Ed Snowden was, the benefits are usually different, and also the contracts are not long-term, whereas if you are a government worker, you are part of the government employment system. Therefore, you are not temporary, you are full-time, and you are organized, you are represented by a union. Whereas if you are a private worker, you are not. Moving on to another item here has come to our attention by the Krebs on Security, or Krebs Security. Massive breach of identity theft across the U.S. Social Security numbers, birth records, credit and background reports on millions of Americans. These are held by what we call in the U.S. data brokers, and they are all over the world. They even managed to get the CIA Director Brennan, Michelle Obama, the at that time Director of the FBI Mueller. So you can imagine if they can get these people, they can get virtually any American citizen. And they were selling these off. There are a number of large networks. LexisNexis, that's one that I've used in the past. It's the world's largest electronic database for legal and public records. There's a lot of money to be made in public records, and these behemoths snatch them up. Now on this Bostonred online dashboard, it showed a tiny unauthorized program called NBCX. It was placed on the service in, April of 2013. It's designed to open all encrypted communication from within Lexis internal network to the botnet controller on the public internet. Other companies, Dun & Bradstreet, they're out of New Jersey. We're listed with Dun & Bradstreet. They give ratings to businesses. Basically speaking, their business has changed a bit over time. Business and corporations use it to make credit decisions. In other words, how long the business has been there, how much the business does the business do? How much business does the business do? It's a business to business model there at Dunn and Bradstreet. So these characters are out there. Number one, called Background America. It's a company that provides employment background, drug and health screening. Called Background America is now part of Higher Right. There's so many of these companies out here. Most people don't realize that these companies are the ones that literally keep a massive amount of data. So the bot malware has been out there using something called virtualtotal.com there, and they were actually selling this information on the piecemeal for as little, I believe, as $1.25. We have a shot up there of this particular operation that they were offering. That site is down now, but no doubt they're in business someplace else. The Lexus people claim that it was report was generated from a law school student's ID that was misused. These background reports are put out there on SSDOB's records. That's the thief service there. And was still able to order. I'll just give them the report here from Krebs there. So in other words, a lot of volume there. So this particular service, SSNBDOB, had been licensed by a number of high-volume users. So they were able to license the service and thus move it on to other sites. In other words, all over the internet, these collection of databases had been compromised and sold off to various people for their use. In other words, you could buy it individually, or you could buy it in volume from these sellers. So effectively what the sellers were doing was duplicating what the data brokers do. They will also sell the information to you, and they were selling it, I guess you'd call it, second hand. So let's see, it's 1 million Social Security numbers of customers and 3.1 million birth records have been scrutinized by this service since 2012. So they've been highly successful in not only one site, but many sites in the Russian Federation, in the UK, and in the U.S., people were using their services to obtain various types of information. So, in other words, people could get the information, and off they would go with this information. So this is part of our site. This story came, incidentally, from the BBC, but Krebs was actually the place that we got the information there. Just highlighting a few things. In the western state of Montana, a convicted rapist was freed after 30 days. A judge gave him literally 30 days for raping a woman. Excuse me, and now he's a quote-unquote free person. China will place a space station by 2023. It'll be in a lower orbit there, and they'll launch built by the International Astrological Congress. That's in Beijing. The China Manned Space Agency, the space station will cover an area of 60 square meters. And it'll be 18.1 meter long and weigh roughly 22 metric tons. So China will be in the business. They have been working on some manned flights. First manned docking station last year. So they're working on other stations as they move into the technological sphere. We'll take a quick look here at some of the international news from Al Jazeera. I think, and a little bit on President Obama. In the U.S., we're still working on getting some type of national health care. And the president has been out on the road again talking about the opposition party, which is the Republicans and the doomsday types. They've been trying to literally defund Obamacare. It won't happen, but they are working on it. And that's one of the reasons in the U.S., much of the attention, the UN is meeting, much of the attention to the UN, you don't hear about it in the media because it has what little there is on the deficit crisis in Washington and also on this national health care. Sudan's president won't attend the UN as death tolls mount. Omar al-Bashir want to be able to go there in Khartoum. This war has been going on, and we'll have more of this. And one last item here, the International Court, and something has to be done about this, upheld the conviction of the former Liberian President Charles Taylor. And that was a 50-year sentence for aiding rebels in the neighboring Sierra Leone. Well, part of the problem there is when you start talking about aiding people in various internal, civil, whatever kinds of conflicts, you have a situation whereby you now have various governments aiding the rebels or terrorists in Syria. And will they be prosecuted? The same thing happened in Libya because people were killed. Now, it was an 11-year civil conflict. 50,000 people were left dead, but over 100,000 in Syria. So this is a situation that needs to be taken care of. Now, we see also, as we talked a little about this organization called Human Rights Watch. According to them, Taylor's conviction sends a powerful message that those at the top can be held accountable for the gravest crimes. That's from Human Rights Watch. Elsie Kepler. The Taylor trial in the Sierra Leone Special Court worked overall has made a major contribution to justice for brutal crimes committed during the Sierra Leone conflict. Well, one of the problems here is that this whole conflict is seen from different sides of the aisle. The West and the people there. Charles Taylor was convicted here of aiding and abetting Sierra Leonean rebel forces, which that happened in Libya. No one's been convicted of anything. And also the groups, the Revolutionary United Front and Armed Forces Council, in return, he was given blood diamonds mined by slave labor in Sierra Leone. Well, I guess you could equate the blood diamonds, and the problem there is the diamonds were mined there, but the diamonds had to be taken to Amsterdam or Israel via various brokers to get back into the West. So those people were not taken to the trial, and that is a problem. And the various countries across West Africa and various other places are crying foul over this because the International Court has become the court of the West. The people that are going there are people primarily from Africa, some from the former Serbia, but people from France, UK, US are not going there. And you can't really call the International Court if that were the case. Charges have been brought against various people, including at least petitions. The former President G.W. Bush So, and various others, Henry Kissinger, and you name them. So if you're going to have that kind of setup, you have to have one that will look at all of the so-called war criminals and bring them the task there. On Kissinger, there's a solid case. On G.W. Bush, with his weapons of mass destruction, where millions of people were killed, there is definitely a solid case. So we have to look to these. Nonetheless, it's on to President Obama at the UN. This is Bostonred speaking from the East, as one would say, on the 26th day of September 2013 in New York. Good day.
And empires, divisions of race and religion and tribe were settled through the sword and the clash of armies. The idea that nations and peoples could come together in peace to solve their disputes and advance a common prosperity seemed unimaginable. It took the awful carnage of 2 world wars to shift our thinking. The leaders who built the United Nations were not naive. They did not think this body could eradicate all wars. But in the wake of millions dead and continents in rubble, and with the development of nuclear weapons that could annihilate a planet, they understood that humanity could not survive the course it was on. And so they gave us this institution, believing that it could allow us to resolve conflicts, enforce rules of behavior, and build habits of cooperation that would grow stronger over time. Now, for decades, the United Nations has, in fact, made a difference, from helping to eradicate disease, to educating children, to brokering peace. But like every generation of leaders, we face new and profound challenges, and this body continues to be tested. The question is whether we possess the wisdom and the courage, as nation states and members of an international community, to squarely meet those challenges. Whether the United Nations can meet the test of our time. And for much of my tenure as president, some of our most urgent challenges have revolved around an increasingly integrated global economy and our efforts to recover from the worst economic crisis of our lifetime. Now, 5 years after the global economy collapsed, and thanks to coordinated efforts by the countries here today, jobs are being created, global financial systems have stabilized, and people are once again being lifted out of poverty. But this progress is fragile and unequal, and we still have work to do together to assure that our citizens can access the opportunities that they need to thrive in the 21st century. Together, we've also worked to end a decade of war. 5 years ago, nearly 180,000 Americans were serving in harm's way, and the war in Iraq was the dominant issue in our relationship with the rest of the world. Today, all of our troops have left Iraq. Next year, an international coalition will end its war in Afghanistan, having achieved its mission of dismantling the core of al-Qaeda that attacked us on 9/11. For the United States, these new circumstances have also meant shifting away from a perpetual war footing. Beyond bringing our troops home, we have limited the use of drones so they target only those who pose a continuing imminent threat to the United States, where capture is not feasible and there's a near certainty of no civilian casualties. We're transferring detainees to other countries and trying terrorists in courts of law, while working diligently to close the prison at Guantanamo Bay. And just as we reviewed how we deploy our extraordinary military capabilities in a way that lives up to our ideals, we've begun to review the way that we gather intelligence so that we properly balance the legitimate security concerns of our citizens and allies with the privacy concerns that all people share. As a result of this work and cooperation with allies and partners, the world is more stable than it was 5 years ago. But even a glance at today's headlines indicates that dangers remain. In Kenya, we've seen terrorists target innocent civilians in a crowded shopping mall, and our hearts go out to the families of those who've been affected. In Pakistan, nearly 100 people were recently killed by suicide bombers outside a church. In Iraq, killings and car bombs continue to be a terrible part of life. And meanwhile, Al-Qaeda has splintered into regional networks and militias, which doesn't give them the capacity, splintered into regional networks and militias, which doesn't give them the capacity at this point to carry out attacks like 9/11, but does pose serious threats to governments and diplomats, businesses and civilians all across the globe. Just as significantly, the convulsions in the Middle East and North Africa have laid bare deep divisions within societies as an old order is upended and people grapple with what comes next. Peaceful movements have too often been answered by violence from those resisting change and from extremists trying to hijack change. Sectarian conflict has reemerged, and the potential spread of weapons of mass destruction continues to cast a shadow over the pursuit of peace. Nowhere have we seen these trends converge more powerfully than in Syria. There, peaceful protests against an authoritarian regime were met with repression and slaughter. In the face of such carnage, many retreated to their sectarian identities, Alawite and Sunni, Christian and Kurd, and the situation spiraled into civil war. The international community recognized the stakes early on, but our response has not matched the scale of the challenge. Aid cannot keep pace with the suffering of the wounded and displaced. A peace process is stillborn. America and others have worked to bolster the moderate opposition, but extremist groups have still taken root to exploit the crisis. Assad's traditional allies have propped him up, citing principles of sovereignty to shield his regime. And on August 21st, the regime used chemical weapons in an attack that killed more than 1,000 people, including hundreds of children. Now, the crisis in Syria and the destabilization of the region goes to the heart of broader challenges that the international community must now confront. How should we respond to conflicts in the Middle East and North Africa? Conflicts between countries, but also conflicts within them. How do we address the choice of standing callously by while children are subjected to nerve gas, or embroiling ourselves in someone else's civil war? What's the role of force in resolving disputes that threaten the stability of the region and undermine all basic standards of civilized conduct? And what's the role of the United Nations and international law in meeting cries for justice? Today I want to outline where the United States of America stands on these issues. With respect to Syria, we believe that as a starting point, the international community must enforce the ban on chemical weapons. When I stated my willingness to order a limited strike against the Assad regime in response to the brazen use of chemical weapons, I did not do so lightly. I did so because I believe it is in the national security interest of the United States and in the interest of the world to meaningfully enforce a prohibition whose origins are older than the United Nations itself. The ban against the use of chemical weapons, even in war, has been agreed to by 98% of humanity. It is strengthened by the searing memories of soldiers suffocating in the trenches, Jews slaughtered in gas chambers, Iranians poisoned in the many tens of thousands. The evidence is overwhelming that the Assad regime used such weapons on August 21st. UN inspectors gave a clear accounting that advanced rockets fired large quantities of sarin gas at civilians. These rockets were fired from a regime-controlled neighborhood and landed in opposition neighborhoods. It's an insult to human reason and to the legitimacy of this institution to suggest that anyone other than the regime carried out this attack. Now, I know that in the immediate aftermath of the attack, there were those who questioned the legitimacy of even a limited strike in the absence of a clear mandate from the Security Council. But without a credible military threat, the Security Council had demonstrated no inclination to act at all. However, as I've discussed with President Putin for over a year, most recently in St. Petersburg, my preference has always been a diplomatic resolution to this issue. And in the past several weeks, the United States, Russia, and our allies have reached an agreement to place Syria's chemical weapons under international control and then to destroy them. The Syrian government took a first step by giving an accounting of its stockpiles. Now there must be a strong Security Council resolution to verify that the Assad regime is keeping its commitments. And there must be consequences if they fail to do so. If we cannot agree even on this, then it will show that the United Nations is incapable of enforcing the most basic of international laws. On the other hand, if we succeed, it will send a powerful message that the use of chemical weapons has no place in the 21st century, and that this body means what it says. Now, agreement on chemical weapons should energize a larger diplomatic effort to reach a political settlement within Syria. I do not believe that military action by those within Syria or by external powers can achieve a lasting peace. Nor do I believe that America or any nation should determine who will lead Syria. That is for the Syrian people to decide. Nevertheless, a leader who slaughtered his citizens and gassed children to death cannot regain the legitimacy to lead a badly fractured country. The notion that Syria can somehow return to a pre-war status quo is a fantasy. It's time for Russia and Iran to realize that insisting on Assad's rule will lead directly to the outcome that they fear, an increasingly violent space for extremists to operate. In turn, those of us who continue to support the moderate opposition must persuade them that the Syrian people cannot afford a collapse of state institutions, and that a political settlement cannot be reached without addressing the legitimate fears and concerns of Alawites and other minorities. We are committed to working this political track, and as we pursue a settlement, let's remember this is not a zero-sum endeavor. We're no longer in a Cold War. There's no great game to be won, nor does America have any interest in Syria beyond the well-being of its people, the stability of its neighbors, the elimination of chemical weapons, and ensuring that it does not become a safe haven for terrorists. I welcome the influence of all nations that can help bring about a peaceful resolution of Syria's civil war. And as we move the Geneva process forward, I urge all nations here to step up to meet humanitarian needs in Syria and surrounding countries. America's committed over $1 billion to this effort. And today I can announce that we will be providing an additional $340 million. No aid can take the place of a political resolution that gives the Syrian people the chance to rebuild their country. But it can help desperate people to survive. What broader conclusions can be drawn from America's policy towards Syria? I know there are those who've been frustrated by our unwillingness to use our military might to depose Assad and believe that a failure to do so indicates a weakening of American resolve in the region. Others have suggested that my willingness to direct even limited military strikes to deter the further use of chemical weapons shows we've learned nothing from Iraq and that America continues to seek control over the Middle East for our own purposes. In this way, the situation in Syria mirrors a contradiction that has persisted in the region for decades. The United States is chastised for meddling in the region, accused of having a hand in all manner of conspiracy. At the same time, the United States is blamed for failing to do enough to solve the region's problems and for showing indifference towards suffering Muslim populations. I realize some of this is inevitable, given America's role in the world. But these contradictory attitudes have a practical impact on the American people's support for our involvement in the region and allow leaders upon democracy and openness and the dignity of the individual will ultimately be more stable, more prosperous, and more peaceful. Over the last few years, particularly in Egypt, we've seen just how hard this transition will be. Mohamed Morsi was democratically elected, but proved unwilling or unable to govern in a way that was fully inclusive. The interim government that replaced him responded to the desires of millions of Egyptians who believed the revolution had taken a wrong turn. But it too has made decisions inconsistent with inclusive democracy through an emergency law and restrictions on the press and civil society and opposition parties. Of course, America has been attacked by all sides of this internal conflict, simultaneously accused of supporting the Muslim Brotherhood and engineering their removal of power. In fact, the United States has purposely avoided choosing sides. Our overriding interest throughout these past few years has been to encourage a government that legitimately reflects the will of the Egyptian people and recognizes true democracy as requiring a respect for minority rights and the rule of law, freedom of speech and assembly, and a strong civil society. That remains our interest today. And so going forward, the United States will maintain a constructive relationship with the interim government that promotes core interests like the Camp David Accords and counterterrorism. We'll continue support in areas like education that directly benefit the Egyptian people. But we have not proceeded with the delivery of certain military systems. And our support will depend upon Egypt's progress in pursuing a more democratic path. And our approach to Egypt reflects a larger point. More democratic path. And our approach to Egypt reflects a larger point. The United States will at times work with governments that do not meet, at least in our view, the highest international expectations, but who work with us on our core interests. Nevertheless, we will not stop asserting principles that are consistent with our ideals, whether that means opposing the use of violence as a means of suppressing dissent or supporting the principles embodied in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. We will reject the notion that these principles are simply Western exports, incompatible with Islam or the Arab world. We believe they are the birthright of every person. And while we recognize that our influence will at times be limited, although we will be wary of efforts to impose democracy through military force, and although we will at times be accused of hypocrisy and inconsistency, we will be engaged in the region for the long haul, for the hard work of forging freedom and democracy is the task of a generation. And this includes efforts to resolve sectarian tensions that continue to surface in places like Iraq, Bahrain, and Syria. We understand such long-standing issues cannot be solved by outsiders. They must be addressed by Muslim communities themselves. But we've seen grinding conflicts come to an end before. Most recently in Northern Ireland, where Catholics and Protestants finally recognized that an endless cycle of conflict was causing both communities to fall behind a fast-moving world. And so we believe those same sectarian conflicts can be overcome in the Middle East and North Africa. To summarize, the United States has a hard-earned humility when it comes to our ability to determine events inside other countries. You know, the notion of American empire may be useful propaganda, but it isn't borne out by America's current policy or by public opinion. Indeed, as recent debates within the United States over Syria clearly showed, the danger for the world is not an America that is too eager to immerse itself in the affairs of other countries or to take on every problem in the region as its own. The danger for the world is that the United States, after a decade of war, rightly concerned about issues back home, aware of the hostility that our engagement in the region has engendered throughout the Muslim world, may disengage, creating a vacuum of leadership that no other nation is ready to fill. Now, I believe such disengagement would be a mistake. I believe America must remain engaged for our own security, but I also believe the world is better for it. Some may disagree, but I believe America is exceptional, in part because we have shown a willingness, through the sacrifice of blood and treasure, to stand up not only for our own narrow self-interest, but for the interests of all. I must be honest, though. We're far more likely to invest our energy in those countries that want to work with us, that invest in their people instead of a corrupt few, that embrace a vision of society where everyone can contribute, men and women, Shia or Sunni, Muslim, Christian or Jew. Because from Europe to Asia, from Africa to the Americas, nations that have persevered on a democratic path have emerged more prosperous, more peaceful, and more invested in upholding our common security and our common humanity. And I believe that the same will hold true for the Arab world. This leads me to a final point. There will be times when the breakdown of societies is so great, the violence against civilians so substantial, that the international community will be called upon to act. This will require new thinking and some very tough choices. While the United Nations was designed to prevent wars between states, increasingly we face the challenge of preventing slaughter within states. And these challenges will grow more pronounced as we are confronted with states that are fragile, preventing slaughter within states. And these challenges will grow more pronounced as we